This is another iROAR podcast.
And what I really enjoyed the last 3 chapters of the book, where I talk much more about how modern day dogs in science are very much companions to science. You know, they're dogs that fit into family environments and that are cared for, catered for, and are more like volunteers than they are, you know, research. Unfortunately, the rest of the research animals.
Welcome to the Animal Turn podcast. So this is some bonus content for you while we're in between seasons. I'm currently busy finishing up my PhD and I'm just taking a spot of time to focus on that at the moment. But you have some bonus episodes and content to look forward to while I do that and brainstorm a little bit about what the next season could be on. So in this bonus episode, I'm going to be speaking to Jules Howard. Jules Howard is a UK-based zoological correspondent, science writer, and broadcaster who writes for The Guardian, BBC Wildlife, and Science Focus. His latest book, which we're going to be speaking about today quite a bit, is Wonderdog, The Science of Dogs and Their Unique Friendship with Humans. And it came out in November 2022. Jules has appeared regularly on TV and radio, including Good Morning Britain, BBC Newsround, BBC Breakfast, and BBC Radio 4. Jules is also an author of several other books, including Sex on Earth and Death on Earth. It was so much fun to speak to Jules about his book. And while this is a book review, I still wanted to kind of center the conversation a little bit on a concept. So we focused the conversation around the idea of wonder. And I think that it's really a beautiful concept. In many ways, I think that this idea of wonder and awe will take us out of several of the issues that we face in the world today. But we focus on wonder. And what does it mean to wonder about how we know things? And how do different animals help us wonder about things? And how are dogs wonderful? So we do a whole lot of talking about wonder. We have a lot of fun throughout the episode. I'm still finding my feet a little bit with how to do and think about book reviews. So if you've got any thoughts or ideas, please feel free to let me know. And just before we jump into the interview as well, I just want to say a quick thank you to the longtime sponsor of the podcast, Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law, and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E. Thank you for sponsoring this podcast. If you are interested in sponsoring this podcast or a particular episode or season for the podcast, feel free to reach out to me at info@theanimalturnpodcast.com. All right, but I think that's enough for now. I hope you enjoy listening. Hi, Jules. Welcome to the Animal Turn podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you, which I say to every guest at the beginning of every episode, but I really do mean it. I enjoy these conversations. And I've just finished reading your book and it was amazing. So Wonderdog just came out, right? It's hot off the press. When did it come out?
It's been out, I think, about 2.5 months. So yeah, I think that still classes as, you know, hot off the press. But yeah, and it came out in the UK, last May. So it's been, I'm glad that you enjoyed it, and thanks ever so much for reading it.
Yeah, I mean, I love dogs, and dogs come up all the time, and I think, you know, reading about dogs is always fun. But you do it in a really kind of fascinating and interesting way, where you're kind of charting. It's not so much about dogs purely, but more about kind of how a variety of scientists have historically come upon dogs and come to know them and found out really interesting things about dogs and the world. So it's a great read. But before we go into that, and we're going to be talking about your book, but I was hoping today that we would speak a little bit about the concept of wonder, because I think that threaded throughout the book is kind of the activity of wonder, like wondering what's happening on, but also wonder and awe at what's being found. So I'd really like if we could talk about that today. But before we do, I even tried to look, I was looking you up, I was on your website, and you are very modest with your about page. There's like 5 sentences. So I tried to do my due diligence, and I know that you're a prolific writer and you're a biologist, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you came to do what you do?
So I was always really interested in animals, and academically was very interested in evolution and animal behaviour. And from that, I mean, I don't know how this differs to your experience in the US, but, in the UK, I kind of came out of university kind of like, oh my God, I need to work with, I want to work with animals. And the options were really, really kind of limited. And I didn't have it in me like you to go, through the PhD kind of life. I don't think that was it just didn't really suit me, I think, at the time. And basically, I'm a massive zoology generalist. And I think it was really scary to sort of, to narrow down. But yeah, and then from that, I basically eventually realized that I got a lot of thrill from talking about animals and a lot of thrill from writing about animals. And it was about, after various jobs with frogs, actually, in wildlife charities and bird charities, I eventually, realized that I just absolutely loved writing, and I loved it's in a funny sort of way. I don't know if this is true or not, but to me, writing a book is like doing a miniature PhD. Do you know what I mean? You're really throwing yourself into this thing and you're asking questions and really excited to try and answer those questions. And I guess unlike a PhD, you finish a book and you're kind of like, what's next? Whereas I assume, I don't know, for you, you're already thinking what's coming on next, or like...
Yeah, it's a PhD. Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping to turn my PhD into a book, but we'll see. Because I think when you get to the end of the PhD, you're also like, oh, yes, what's next? Like 5 years. I mean, I love what I do, and I'm very fortunate to be kind of focused on animals. But I think it's also kind of remarkable and interesting. I think a lot of people find themselves doing academia or jumping into masters or PhDs when that's not really their jam. I love kind of this space and what I'm doing. And I think I actually wish more and more people would be like you and say, hey, that's not my jam. I'm going to go out into the world and figure out what I enjoy. But what is, and I know this is going to seem like a strange question coming from an animal studies based podcast, but there's a lot of words flying around. What is zoology exactly? When we're talking about zoology, what is this, evolutionary biology, or what does it mean when you say you studied zoology?
So, zoology, obviously the science of animal life. And I think, where you section it off, I suppose nowadays that would include, genetics, animal behavior, taxonomy. There's some quite sort of broad topics, and also it obviously goes quite often into ecology as well. So how animals interact with their environments and influence their environments. So it's quite a broad church, I guess you would say. And I think, well, for me, I've kind of liked dipping into different aspects of it. And I think sometimes, going back to the book thing, that's what you do. And in fact, with children's books, what often happens, I don't know if this is universal, but for me, like a publisher might say, okay, we need a book on taxonomy or something like that. And my knowledge of taxonomy has just faded away over the years, and you can get sort of re-involved in a project like that and just be, sort of re-inspired, I suppose, by it. So yeah, definitely a broad topic. But in my experience, I'd be interested to know how this compares with the US. When I was studying zoology, and it was like, this is, I'm ancient, this was like 20 years ago, most people were on that course to do with animal behavior. So that seemed to be the big thing that most people kind of were attached to, is the idea of why animals, behave the way they do. What's it like to be an animal? What are they thinking? How intelligent are they? How easy is it for us to compare the human experience with the animal experience? So that was definitely the motivating question.
And when you were at university, with these types of questions primarily at the university in like lab settings and in classrooms, or did you also go out into the field and observe kind of in an ecological sense as well, or ethological? Sorry, wrong.
Yeah,
word.
I mean, you would think we would. You would absolutely think we would, and must say it didn't really happen for us. I think I mean, we did have some field trips in the UK. I think this problem still exists. People who had maybe, like, I want to say family money, but that sounds a bit derogatory. But I mean, people who could afford it would go off, spend the summer, in the Caribbean, studying turtles and things like that. And there was a bit of a division, I suppose, depending on how much money people had, which is really sad. And I think, and we both know this is still the case now, but it massively limits the diversity of people who survive zoology, and I think that in the UK we still have quite a problem with it. Zoology it's still a kind of middle class, sort of zone, a white zone. So that's still a problem, I think, today. So yeah, we didn't like do much. Weirdly, what we did do, which has changed now, I was speaking to a professor of zoology recently, and we did a lot of dissection. And I would say out of 200 of us, only about 2 or 3 people would say, I can't do this, or I don't feel able to do this. And then, for that was what, 20, more than, blimey, oh my gosh, that was 25 years ago. Oh, damn, I've just added 5 years on.
Those realizations are the best.
But, I think that's very, very interesting in terms of our relationship with animals, is that was kind of the norm. And funny enough, I was thinking about it today, in preparation for our talking. And I mean, I like to think that saved the universities a lot of money by, modifying the syllabus and not relying so much on live and obviously dead animals. But, I don't want to talk about some of the stories, but there was actually looking back, some really kind of disgusting and horrific aspects to that, very, not good. But again, at the time, you realize how culture changes. Really, at the time, we kind of thought that was what you had to do.
Yeah, and I mean, it is heartening, at least, to see, and this is also a theme throughout your book, that things can change. Of course, universities are still doing these kinds of experiments and tests today, and I think students still find their ability to say something is, you've paid a lot of money to be at university, and your ability to say something, you're not too sure what's appropriate. It's a new space. So yeah, it's universities, and I think what goes on in labs are often like these big black boxes, which is, at least to me, so I don't go into labs. I'm in the social sciences side of things. So my access to a lab is actually extremely limited, which is interesting. You mentioned there children's books. So I know that you write a whole host of children's books, and this is, I think, quite remarkable. And you're clearly a science communicator and someone who's interested in education. You've got all of these like VR education experiences and things you're working on. What got you into kind of this desire to communicate stories about animals and about nature and science, I think, generally?
I would say one of the big things for me, it's funny we talk about university. I haven't talked about university for absolutely ages, but one of the things I really was quite shocked by was how little, and again, this is definitely a difference between the UK and obviously elsewhere, particularly North America. But basically, went through university and realised actually, goodness me, evolution, Darwin's, big idea. It really did explain everything in the topic. So by the end of that, that 4 years, it was kind of obvious, really. You could link all of these different threads, the threads I mentioned before, taxonomy, behavior, diversity, ecology. You could link these together in this really nice evolutionary framework. And I think I came out of that kind of like, wow, I should have known that before I went in. And my granddad was a vicar, and I wonder whether or not there was some sort of thing going on there, maybe they didn't really want me to know. And I went to university and blew my mind. But I really, really came out wanting to definitely not convince people about evolution, but I definitely wanted to go out and sort of get across that magical feeling of kind of, oh my gosh, everything's interrelated and fits within this really, really beautiful framework. And I think I wanted to make sure I could share that with other people, essentially people who were like me before I went to university. So that was definitely a really big factor. And then the kind of, now I realise, I think when I used to draw comics when I was really, really young, and a bit of me is still doing that now, and just coming up with kind of slightly crazy ideas and then fitting animals, within that, if that makes sense. So I definitely love the idea of doing something creative and seeing what it opens up. And then what it's like with projects. Sometimes you start on something and it goes wrong, or something's not happening right, and you have to try something else, and then you discover something even more interesting. So I think for me, that's where I get a lot of the pleasure is saying, okay, here's some science, here's the science of animals, let's express it in a new way and see how audiences respond to that. And I would say nearly always they don't respond as well as I hope.
Oh,
but that's kind of
it's
kind of the joy of it, But that's kind of the joy of it in some ways, is like seeing, what works and what doesn't. It's a lovely feeling.
Well, I think you've done some wonderful work, and as someone who's busy writing at the moment now, I know that it can be exceedingly difficult to say ideas simply. And I think that it's an art that's underappreciated, because particularly in kind of academia, because things are so complex, we sometimes get a bit too verbose, and your writing certainly kind of makes things, it crystallizes things, and you say it quite clearly. And you were speaking somewhat there, I think, about this idea of wonder, that university kind of brought you to the wonder of evolution. And it is quite remarkable when you just kind of realize what life does, right? Like that the same particles that make me up have been around forever, right? Like there's something just absolutely astronomical and awe-inspiring about the ideas of how we've changed and how life has changed on the planet. So let's get into this idea of wonder a bit and into the book. Firstly, let's just maybe give a bit of a synopsis of the book. What was your goal with Wonderdog, and what were you hoping to kind of communicate and get across?
It's not a book about the science of dog minds, although that is a key part of it, because so many brilliant scientists, there's some absolutely amazing dog writers out there who have eloquently expressed all sorts of evolutionary ideas about what it's like to be a dog, particularly Alexandra Horowitz, who I just think is just such a great writer. She's amazing.
Honestly, when I saw her blurb on your book, I was like, yeah, okay, he's good. I'm going to have him on the I'm going to have him on the podcast, because Alexandra Horowitz is just like, she's amazing, and I agree with you. I don't know why I haven't anyway.
Well, you can imagine what I was like when I was like, oh my God, I fell off my chair. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, she is really a rock star in the world of dogs.
Totally.
Amazing.
So that's what I wanted to do, really, is talk about the history of animal cognition, how over the last 150 years it's changed. And dogs, I thought, would be a nice way they would be great characters to tell that story. And obviously, starting on it, I was like, actually, no, these dogs really are characters, so this succession of what I would call wonder dogs. So individual dogs that inspired questions in the scientists with whom they cohabit, that really did kind of change our appreciation of what it's like to be a dog, what it's like to be a cat, a human, a chimpanzee, so it was a way, the dogs, if you like, with a way in to understanding more about animal minds. So essentially, I guess between us, and again, I don't think I've ever said this out loud before, but I guess I was looking at a big dog market of people. Lots of people, really do connect with their dogs and their cats. And how do you develop their understanding of their dogs and cats? And I wanted to add sort of evolutionary, cognitive science into the pet owner's lexicon, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I think many of us relate to dogs in our daily lives and can kind of empathize with some of the stories and the characters you unpack. And I think the idea that being around animals can inspire certain questions and can inspire certain kind of reflections on what it is you're finding and what it is you're doing is quite remarkable. So you kind of start the book with Darwin, who we've spoken a bit about now, but you kind of start with how these evolutionary ideas, or just ideas of evolution kind of began to some extent. And then you kind of, every chapter shows how a particular set of research or ideas related to dogs has a story. And I think it's a story that involves particular dogs, but it's a story that involves particular scientists as well, asking quite particular questions. And I think what the chapters do quite well is you step on, like you're building on this kind of idea, showing how, I guess, right in the beginning. So behaviorism was kind of a really big thing right in the beginning. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what was behaviorism, and how did we originally think about dogs as beings and the science around that?
Yeah, I mean, you can think of the last 150 years as a kind of war between scientists that thought it was all about nurture rather than nature, and the other half of these zoologists and animal scientists saying it's about nature. So it's in our DNA inevitably. And for the first, Darwin was very much of a kind of like, okay, humans are mammals, we share ancestors with dogs, therefore we differ in our cognitive abilities only by degree. And then from that, you get much more laboratory-based science through Ivan Pavlov, basically, through the famous bell, although there wasn't a bell, but anyway, we won't go into that, the bell ringing and dogs salivating, and this idea that essentially the body could react to its external environment, without the brain even needing to be engaged. So in other words, every behavior that animals, including humans, give off is based on a, you know, positive or negative experience in our past, if that makes sense. So that idea was obviously started with Pavlov, and it's what I still find incredibly interesting is that, you know, in the UK, this sort of science, after Darwin died, we had quite a strong, because obviously there was a boom in dog populations in the UK, particularly in London, and we had dogs' homes, the first dog homes. We had rabies on the street, so we had the removal of street dogs. Because of this close attachment that a lot of, you know, polite society had with dogs in the UK, we were, you know, there was a big war between vivisectionists and anti-vivisectionists, and it was such a contentious issue in the end that, you know, we stepped away from that kind of science. So Russia became a big seat of influence. Some of those ideas spread over to the US and, you know, the early sort of psychology circles, I guess you could say. So, you know, Skinner was part of that. B.F. Skinner, who was the kind of radical behaviorist, I guess you could say. So essentially, you know, that's what it came down to. The mind was the mind was a blank slate, and experiences, you know, filled in that space and it influenced all behaviours that we see. There was literally no room for nature at all. And then what's kind of interesting in the kind of 1950s is when we start getting a better understanding of genetics, and in fact some really amazing, like 10-year studies involving, you know, breeding dogs, different strains of dogs, and looking at their behaviours. What we realised, of course, is, my goodness me, you know, dogs definitely are both nature and nurture. So we see differences between breeds because of breeding, not because of differences in their, you know, when they were in their puppy stage, if that, so to speak. So it's a kind of changing, as I say, if you imagine it on a graph, it's like kind of nature and nurture. They're both there. Now we realise that they're both interesting aspects of the science of animal minds. But it took a long time to get here. A lot of, you know, unfortunately butchered dogs, you know, particularly in Pavlov's age, you know, were you know, it's really kind of harrowing to imagine it. But, you know, it took a long time to get to this stage we're at now, really.
Yeah, this was something I was hoping to talk to you about, because it was quite clear to me that throughout the book you were trying to not speak about some of these violences. And I think only recently, are people looking at Pavlov with more kind of scrutiny. I mean, obviously at the time with the anti-vivisectionist movements, there was this kind of backlash. But recently, I think folks are looking at how many dogs. I think we've all got this idea that it was like Pavlov and one dog doing something, but he had many dogs that he was conducting experiments on. And many of these experiments were, as you say, quite, for the dogs involved, really quite violent and not pleasant. But I did notice kind of throughout the book that you try to not speak about the violence. You actually say, I'm not going to get into these details. Was there a particular reason why you didn't want to kind of spend time with that?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. So a lot of the end notes obviously do include some of the more of the, you know, the gory details, I suppose you could say. I was really, you know, when they say when you're writing a book, you have to sort of picture your reader. And my reader in my head was actually my mother-in-law, who's always been a dog lover. And she's, you know, scientifically literate, you know, but definitely hasn't really considered the science of dog minds, I guess. And I know that with many people, and we all know people like this, and it may be you as, you know, as well, Claudia, but visibly, I mean, emotionally horrified and distraught about descriptions of some of this stuff. So I was kind of wary of that, but I also wanted to include that it really did happen. You know, I name by name, you know, as you've read, like the Pavlov's dogs, and as you say, there was many of them. Because of that reason, is kind of like, I don't think we should just forget about this or blur it out of history. You know, it's really barbaric, and the kind of the thing that really eats away at me is actually not just the number of dogs that were suffering, but the fact that Pavlov especially was interested in long-term studies. So it was in his interest to keep a dog alive for as long as possible, you know, with the various tubes and stuff attached to collect the digestive enzymes. Sorry, I just said digestive enzymes after sort of clacking and licking my mouth. Sorry, it's disgusting. Salivating.
It's good radio. It's good radio.
Sorry. But yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky balance, and I'm hoping I found, you know, the way through it. But, you know, I mean, again, spare the gruesome details, but I don't think I included this in the book. But, you know, the scientist that discovered homeostasis, so as you know, the body system that regulates, you know, temperature, he came to that by putting dogs in ovens. And the dogs barked so much he removed their vocal cords. And so he basically built a big oven in his cellar. And, you know, this is just absolutely amazing that we're all being taught this. I remember being taught about homeostasis. And at no point does anyone say, I wonder how we discovered homeostasis.
Well, this is exactly right. I mean, I appreciate that. Again, your book was kind of about wonder. And I think that we do have a lot of writing about this violence. And I think we should have writing about this violence and it should be highlighted. But I understand that the intent of your book was to show how wonder and appreciation of how wonderful dogs are can elicit questions and understanding. And you kind of show over time how an appreciation of play and of dogs' personalities is leading to actually more interesting questions than some of those early behaviorists. But my one concern, and I love the book, absolutely, was that you kind of get to this really end stage. And it seems to me like you're suggesting that scientists are no longer doing these types of things to dogs, that we've had this kind of linear progression of behaviorists that are, and that was honestly, the only critique I have of an otherwise beautiful book was I got there and I was like, to someone who maybe doesn't read or know, they might think, okay, so no scientists are doing these types of awful things on dogs. And as of course we know, there are still many animals, dogs included, that kind of experience these things.
No, I think it's an absolutely fair enough point. And I you know, that's been raised as well. I've had another couple of people raise that. And in fact, in a later version of the book, I will be including some information about, in the UK, we still have 4,000 operations on dogs each year in the name of science. And that's actually gone up since Brexit. Obviously, we've dissociated, lost our ties to EU regulation, European regulation. And, you know, that's gone up by 5% already. So, you know, you're absolutely right. And it's definitely, that's the last thing I want to do is to, you know, give the idea that, you know, that's it now, we're done. No more dogs suffer, no more animals suffer, you know, so it's a totally fair point. Yeah, I definitely don't take that in a bad way.
Okay. I felt like I had to say it out loud, but I want to speak more now about kind of the dogs in your book. And you're absolutely right. The dogs are not included in kind of the writing of these stories. And I think what you do throughout your book is you name the dogs. You name several of Pavlov's dogs. You name all of these scientists' dogs, and you show how these dogs kind of raise these questions. And you get to the Brelanders. Is that how you say it? Brelanders?
Yeah, Brelands.
Marion and Brelands, and then thereafter you kind of talk a bit about John Paul Scott and how this marked a really clear shift in kind of thinking about dogs. And they've done a lot of work about dogs. Could you tell us a little bit about them and some of their work?
So, yeah, Scott and Fuller, these two scientists that worked through the 60s. And, you know, they were scientists, particularly Scott had seen, you know, they'd both seen 2 world wars. And they were really, really of the persuasion that bad people aren't born bad. So, you know, criminals, they become criminals in many cases because of a tough childhood, for instance. And they saw in dogs a way to test that hypothesis and look at the impact of puppyhood, experiences in puppyhood, how that affects the adult dog. And essentially they had a bunch of different kennels and enclosures, and they could see what would happen to dogs, for instance, if they had limited contact with humans as puppies, and what would happen if they had loads of contact with humans as puppies, and look at the adult dogs that they became. And in fact, now when we talk about dogs, and I'm sure this is the same for you guys, but you know, you go and see the vet with your puppy in the UK and they'll just keep reinforcing this idea. You need to make sure the puppy is socialized, has as many experiences as possible, and that will obviously inform the dog that the puppy's going to become. And that's as a direct result of that 1960 study that, as I said, went on for like 10 years. And it's a great example of, you know, how ideas about humanity can be informed by science. And in fact, that the end result of that study, which is particularly lovely, is that, you know, after 10 years or so of doing these tests, these separate environments, and seeing what happens to puppies and what adults they become, after all that time, it was obvious that, you know, a badly treated puppy, or a dog that's been kept in, say, a laboratory setting, away from, people or human companions, would end up as a dog with, kind of, I guess we would call them mental health problems, or uncertainty, or aggressive, unpredictable. And because of that 10-year study, that essentially gave more ammo to the anti-vivisectionist argument to get them to limit or start to reduce, hopefully, the number of dogs used in those kind of studies. So it links together a bunch of things, really, hard work, clever methodology, scientists who are human beings who want to solve human problems, and dogs who are, in that case, willing subjects, I guess you could say. So, yeah, I mean, I find that fascinating. And again, I find it fascinating. I spoke to lots of my dog cognition and veterinary friends and said, do you know this whole idea about the socialization period? Do you know where we got that information from? And everyone's like, I never really thought of that. So again, it's nice to remind people of that work. And in fact, it's been said a couple of times that every important American geneticist that has done work in the last 50 years came through that facility. So visited that facility in the 60s to learn about those experiments and see them being done. So again, like these sort of scientists, they seem like really nice guys as well, and to actually, write them down as human beings in a book. It's the first time I've ever written anything like that. And I just think it's really, really, really nice. So yeah, there are human characters as well as the dog characters that we owe a debt to.
And I mean, they changed then, like you said. So there are still, as we've said, dogs that are undergoing certain experimentations, but there is increasingly kind of these setups. And Alexander Horowitz, who we mentioned, is a key example here of finding joy at looking at dogs in dog spaces and figuring out what dogs want to do and how they want to do it. So you spend quite a bit of time talking about play and how play and dogs have had the capacity and options to socialize and enjoy play and how much that changes their cognition. Now, play seems like an obvious thing. It just feels like play is, you see it, you know it when you see it, you're like, they're playing. But it turns out that that hasn't been the case in the world of science. Play, sometimes the things we think are the simplest, like play and happiness, become the most controversial and difficult to talk about. So what is play? What are people wondering and thinking about play?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that expresses itself when tends to be mammals, but some, birds, jackdaws, for instance, can definitely be observed playing. It comes out when animals seem to be relaxed, which is always find really nice and interesting. It's like the ultimate sign of a non-stressed animal, a healthy animal, is when they exhibit play. And you're right. I don't think if we were to discover, I don't know, 2 light years away, a planet with, animal, kind of intelligent life on it, and we were to visit them, I don't think naturally we would expect to see play there. Do you know what I mean? It just seems like a strange evolutionary quirk. And the truth is, we're still not massively sure, are we, why it evolves? And it clearly does give benefits, we think, in terms of experience. It allows animals to sort of simulate things that may depend on later in life. And certainly the physicality of play is no doubt really good. But with dogs, of course, plays, and it seems to me anyway, to be on another level. And what I really enjoyed the last 3 chapters of the book, where I talk much more about how modern day dogs in science are very much companions to science. They're dogs that fit into family environments and that are cared for, catered for, and are more like volunteers than they are, research, unfortunately, the rest of the research animals. But this idea that, all of these laboratory tests, all of these, studies that we read earlier on in the book, that you can basically see for yourself how intelligent dogs are by just walking to the park. Like all of us can just go to a park, exactly like Alexandra did, and see for real in the slow motion kind of interplays between dogs, these sort of micro observations and micro manipulations that dogs are doing to essentially either make the play end if they're a bit bored, or to keep the play going and with the other dog or dogs. And I really think that's great. I mean, back in the day, when I was going back to the university, I suppose it was very much just kind of this idea of theory of mind, and the idea that not all animals understand that they are one individual mind in a sea of other minds, and that their one interpretation of the world may differ from their partner or their brother or their sister or their whatever. And everyone was like, okay, we're going to find this theory of mind in chimpanzees, gorillas. Let's go. This has got to be a primate thing. And actually, there it was all along, you know, in our parks. And many of those scientists, no doubt, were coming back from these big, expensive research trips and sort of petting their pet dog. And, you know, and they never once thinking, oh, hang on. So I really, really, really love that. And in fact, I would say that's the thing I daydream about most when I'm at the park. And, you know, and as you say, it's this beautiful expression of I was going to say manipulation, but it sounds like a bad, you know, a negative thing. But I just mean, you know, essentially sort of extending the good times, I guess. So it's lovely.
Expression is such a good word for it. And I think the thing for me that most startles me about play is sometimes I think one of our best capacities is that we think, and one of our worst capacities is that we think, because, you know, you see multiple species playing across species and you're like, they get it. They get it. I don't know how much they're agonizing over whether or not the other knows that they know that they're all playing, but they clearly enjoy it. I saw a video the other day of a dog and a horse playing, which just shows unbelievable, like, cognitive awareness of another being's body. Like, they're aware of what the other body is capable of. They're aware of there's movement to make sure that you're not hurting the other. There's an awareness that you don't have the same physiology, and they're having the best time. Like, and then of course I'm there as an observer, laughing and smiling at the same. So it's like there's all of this social stuff going on, and it's good. I think play is really just it's an expression of good. That's what it seems like to me.
Yeah, I think that's it, exactly that expression of good.
It's why we as observers can't help but smile when you see kids play or you see animals play. It really is wonderful.
It is so amazing to me that at one point I could basically invent in my bedroom when I was a kid. I could kind of invent a world, and, like, you know, I remember at one point I can't remember what I was into. It's probably some like really bad, awful 80s music, but honestly, I would be singing.
What are you saying about 80s
I was
music?
singing on my bed and I could see an audience there. And it was like, I can't believe my brain was able to do that. And it makes me really sad in some ways that, like, as adults, we kind of, you know, we all have that moment where you sort of go, oh, I'm going to do some make-believe play. And you just go, oh, don't really do that anymore. My brain doesn't do it.
I think
Do
think
you?
we do. I had this. Okay. I know this is slightly off topic, but we're talking about brains and stuff. So I was walking down the stairs the other day and I was thinking about something else, and I was imagining like a lecture hall and what was going on. But I realized in that moment that while I was moving through space down the stairs doing something, my mind was visualizing something else. This is imagination. I'm just no longer kind of creating and crafting monsters and stories, or maybe and maybe some other people are. But maybe just as adults, we, instead of kind of, because it gets kind of imbued with stresses and pressures, we don't view, like, isn't that some people who meditate, don't they like input, like, I don't know, this isn't my realm, like I'm not into neurobiology or science, but I do think that we do as adults create these kind of visions, but it's when we're thinking.
Yes, I know. I think you're absolutely right. And I suppose when we're dreaming, we are, as you say, entering another world in our head, essentially. But it's just a shame we don't really do it. Well, I don't do it as much for fun anymore. But then, like you say, when you're thinking through your PhD stuff and you're thinking of a new angle or a new question, I guess some would argue, well, that's play as well. And when I'm thinking of, like, what's my next book going to be about? Again, I guess in some ways, like, we're playing with ideas, aren't we?
But it's definitely not the same. And maybe my ideas would be better if I continued to build blanket forts and like sat there and try to create. But there is something amazing about that capacity to play. And I find it remarkable that things like play and love create so much angst amongst us. So you end your book talking about love. And you say that this is the dangerous L word that no one wants to talk about because as a scientist, you can't be talking about love. But what ends up leading you to say, no, actually, because you say that the question people can't help but ask you is, do our dogs love us? And you think they do.
Well, I think, well, do you know, can I ask you what your feeling is on that?
I just think they do. I don't question it. Like, so for me, love is not a kind of tangible thing. It's an intimacy and it's a relation, right? So I feel like I just know Linus, my dog, when he's around and he's safe and I'm safe, that's love. Maybe I'm a bit like like the idea of Umwelt, right? Von Uxküll. It's got a love tone. And do I need to put a label on it? Maybe, maybe not. But there is a safety and a security and a kind of a comfort and an intimacy. Because like violence and things can also be intimate, but this is kind of like a safe knowing of one another. And I think that there is love in that. And I think it's got a love tone. So I just don't question it. I think he does love me and I love him. And I think that that's enough. Whether he does or does not, this is my experience and that's his, right?
Yeah, I agree totally with that. I used to get asked that question a lot, and I always felt a bit uncomfortable. As you say, it's a word which means different things to different people. It doesn't feel like a word we can apply scientifically to one another, let alone to our relationship with a companion animal. But it feels to me like there are 5 or 6 different really strong methodologies to infer what is going on inside a dog's brain by way of emotional attachment. And, so you've got the fMRI, scans, which can show dogs and humans reacting to, positive associations in exactly the same way. The oxytocin levels, the various brain hormones and neurochemicals, and how they rise consistently in a way that matches humans. And so these different pillars, I think in the book I call them the kind of pillars of truth. We've erected five of these pillars, and it seems to me that the strength of that argument that dogs can, well, they don't always, but they have the potential to experience something we might call love. It just felt like that argument was so strong, and we haven't got. I personally, I think actually that we shouldn't expect. Why wouldn't dolphins be able to feel their kind of joy of love or the sadness of losing someone? Why would a chimpanzee not? But I think with dogs, because they are so much more accessible and they can be companions in science and volunteers, etc. We've got these really strong pillars now, and I feel like the argument that they are kind of unfeeling robots, which, to be fair, not many people argue that, but that sort of philosophical argument, it needs to be put in the bin, really. And so I think I'm okay with using that word love in a way I wasn't before, because most people respond to, they know roughly what that is and what that feels like. And I hate the idea of somebody buying a dog and putting it in their house and going to work every day for the next 15 years and the dog just sitting on its own in the house. And I really like that. I don't like the idea of that too much. I don't like the idea of people treating dogs badly because they don't think they're capable of the same kinds of emotions that humans are. So I felt pretty, by the end of that research, I felt kind of like it needed to be said. And actually, I thought I would get loads of pushback actually from, I was going to say proper zoologists there, but I thought I was going to get pushback from, but actually, as you say, I think most people they just sort of appreciate that as a sentiment. Yeah, of course they do. We've seen it with our own eyes,
Yeah, no, it's useful to have that kind of like physiological stuff. And those MRI kind of experiments that you mentioned there were also just a really interesting kind of example of how you can learn things without kind of putting leashes on dogs and like caging dogs. Because that was a really brilliant example of positive reinforcement, training dogs how to go into the MRIs, teaching them how to be okay with the loud noises, and learning something pretty remarkable because we are in such close relation with dogs. So those were really, and yeah, the pictures of it are just incredible. Of like seeing these little dogs in MRI scans being totally okay. And it is always nice to be able to say to naysayers, yeah, no, look, there is research to show that dogs' kind of bodies change when we're around in the same ways that we change around people who we would say we love. And I think, to come back to Darwin, where you said difference in kind, this just to me says, okay, well, we should just put this to bed for most animals we're talking about now. Because if we see this kind of relationship with dogs and we see it with ourselves and we see it with, why would we not, like you say, see the same thing with dolphins or with social animals who care for their young? And why would that be anything other than love? What is the impetus to say that us caring for our babies is love, but others caring for their babies is something else. It seems counterintuitive, really.
Yeah, and the word that most back, I was always taught that this word attachment is where it's at. So we can say, as you say, social mammals, they're gonna have an attachment thing, and then with us, we use this special. Well, we've got a special word. It's called love. And as you say, it just doesn't really make any sense, really. And if anything, it risks, as I said, like belittling the emotions of non-human animals and putting us on a pedestal. And I agree with the Darwin thing. I think if there's one research paper I would take back in time and show Darwin, though I think he would love that fMRI one. He'd probably be like, "Whoa, is that what the brain looks like?" But I do think he'd be like, "Wow, that really does essentially prove what my own research is hinting at." So no, I think that's really exciting, and I'd love. I mean, it would be very interesting what other fMRI stuff comes out. It would be fascinating, for instance, to know whether if a dog loses their human companion, what does that look like in the brain? Like how much can they grieve? How much can they understand of the passing or the loss of someone? Or is it just that they're dissociated and they're just the routines changed and the person that they love who used to feed them every day is no longer there? It would be fascinating to know more about that. It'd be interesting to see, wouldn't it?
And I think there's still a really good kind of opportunity for physical and social sciences to work together here, because I think observing dogs whose people have died or have left, there's probably enough evidence just from observing them to see that their behaviors change when the people they rely on are gone. They change, and how do we quantify our own sense of grief and loss? Like we seem to kind of sometimes hold perhaps different standards for what we ask with regards to other animals to prove that they're feeling what they're feeling, whereas we just trust. And I know that there have been experiments done, of course, on humans, and there have been these kinds of questions. But yeah, I think it's pretty remarkable. And you mention at the end of your book Biff, who's I don't want to give everything away, but you mention Biff, and it was really who's your dog. And it makes me think like they are our friends and they are the ones we really love and care for. And, Linus is part of my family. And if he's stressed out when I leave home, that's something I should take seriously. Is I think what you were trying to say there just now. It's not just oh, he's a dog. We need to go beyond that kind of explanation when our dogs get in the way of our kind of supposed clean lives. Oh, he's just a dog.
And that hopefully that spreads. I mean, if we're saying that, we of course say it about cats. If we say it about cats, rabbits, we can, you know what I mean? So I like the idea of dogs and cats actually being a kind of welcome mat, if you like, for how we appreciate mammals and other animals in general. Yeah, definitely. How old's Linus?
Oh gosh, he's almost 4. So we got him from a shelter, and he's very definitely like one of the dogs, you spoke of kind of showing kind of signs of their puppyhood. I think for the first 6 months, he didn't wag his tail, he didn't bark. We got him at 11 months, and he'd already been in the shelter for 3 months. And shelters are pretty stressful environments. And we found out that he'd been passed between 5 families before he got to us. So just he had no kind of sense of trust with people. And now he's got some challenges, but he's a good dog. He's a good person in our lives. I absolutely love him. Whether he loves me or not is irrelevant.
But I love that you just said. I know you meant to say it, didn't you? But you said he's a good person in our lives, and I just think I feel exactly the same about the dogs in our life. I agree totally. They are people. They're family members. I think the saddest thing in the world, but this is what we get for our positive, strong relationship. But it's just that we age so much more slowly than them, and if we could only do something about that, because
no, don't go down that route. Don't do it.
But I just think it's a sort of a beautiful horror, I guess, really, that we have to go through that. And our current dog Oz, he's 2, and I've just got I don't know if you ever do this, but you start counting forwards a bit and going, well, if he's 2 now, it's going to be this, and you sort of, and it does make me sort of really sad. But we've got to just enjoy each other, haven't we, on a day-to-day level.
But like you say, it's also a big responsibility. So because of the time differences, right? Like Linus will be in our lives for, let's say, like 9 to 15 years. And it's sad to think in that way, but we will be in his for the rest of his life. So that comes with a big responsibility. It's not just that he's the background of our lives and he's the wallpaper in our apartment. No, we are his life. So we have a responsibility to not just feed him and keep him, like, to make sure that that's an enriched life and an important life for him. And I think that that's sometimes what gets lost in conversations or posters about getting dogs. I think people have this idea that, oh, I'll get a dog. It'll be like an Instagram post. I'll walk on the beach. There's going to be there's going to be bills. There's going to be times. There's going to be dinners you can't go to. There's going to be things that go wrong. There's going to be fights. There's going to be and there's going to be joys and laughter and amazing things in between. But you are their whole lives. Like, it's your responsibility to make sure it's a good life.
Well, it's weird. I mean, my unpopular opinion, and I don't really express this because I know it's not going to gain me any friends. But I kind of wish we could, when we learn to drive. I don't know how it is in the UK. Anyway, we have to do a theory test as well as the actual, the practical driving test. I just sort of feel like we just need something just before you get into that zone of like, let's get a dog. We're going to have a dog. We're going to have a dog. If just a moment to sort of go. Just be reminded formally, as you say, that for this is a long period of time and it doesn't always work out, and there's things out of your control, and as you say, you've got this massive responsibility. I think about this all the time, but I just find it, if you overthink it, it's kind of crazy. But Linus, I assume, is the same as Oz. Like, Linus knows where you are right now, yeah?
So I'm actually in Canada and he's in Austria. So so maybe not. But when I'm in the house,
when you are together, yes, that's what I meant. Okay.
And if he does, I'll be like, really, Wonderdog. So
yeah. But it is amazing that when you're in the house with Linus, when I'm in the house with Oz, he's got a running commentary in his head of whereabouts I am and what I'm doing and what that routine is. And if I'm going to a certain cupboards, where there might be snacks, it'll get up. If I open a banana in a room 2 doors away, it'll be like, oh, is that the sound of a banana? Right, I'm going to go and try. But, really, as you said, we are one of the centres of their world. And if you're not taking that, if you're not accepting of that fact that you are literally the centre of someone's world, then that's a bit of a it's a bit of a worry, I suppose.
I mean, what a privilege! What an absolute privilege to be that important to someone. And I agree. I think that there should be more, tests done before people can just buy a dog. And I think you shouldn't be able to buy a dog. I think increasingly, you touched on breeding in your book as well, and I think breeding has led to a lot of really devastating physiologies for dogs. These creatures who we absolutely love are born with dispositions that hurt them because we want a dog that looks a particular way. And now that they exist in the world and you've done it, you stick to them no matter what, and you help them because you are, like you say, the center of their world. Pretty remarkable. And something that's just really stuck out for me now with talking is we started out kind of talking about zoology, and we spoke a bit about how some university students would go far away to kind of look at quote unquote exotic animals who deserve to be looked at and deserve to be understood, but that there is also wonder to be had with the animals right around you, the pigeons in your backyard, the sparrow in your roof, the dog in your on your couch, the cats in your windowsill. These are incredible creatures that have thousands of years of histories. So thank you for helping us wonder about the animals we see every day. It's really great.
No, it's a total pleasure. It's really nice, geeking out, really. I don't know if that's but it's really nice. Often, like, I haven't done many podcasts, but often, they're massively generalist, and the topics are very much like, oh, we've got a scientist on, so let's keep it about, like, the science of animals or whatever. But I've actually got loads from speaking to you, and your interest in the sort of academic side of things has been really nice for me. So thank you ever so much.
You're welcome. But we're not quite done yet. I feel like we're gearing up to say goodbye. But we first need to read the quote. Do you have a quote ready?
I do have a quote. Hang on. My quote is by T.H. Huxley, he was called Darwin's bulldog. I'm sure you know. And he was kind of, one of those people that took on Darwin's ideas and was really challenging against, famously against the Christian church. But that's not why I've chosen it. I just think he was someone who really understood zoology, and I'm gonna read it. So it links a lot to what we've talked about with wonder. The known is finite, the unknown infinite. Intellectually, we stand on an islet in the midst of an illimitable ocean of inexplicability. Our business in every generation is to reclaim a little more land. And that was in 1887. And the reason I love it is because this is such a sad thing to admit, I was basically got to about my mid-20s before I realised there were still scientific mysteries unsolved. I don't know what I'd missed in my academic, maturation, but I honestly was just like, okay, here's the deal. You want to learn about animals? Great. These guys are going to tell you about animals. The lecture theatre, you sit and listen to some guy, often a guy, who's going to tell you all you need to know about animals. And that's it. There's nothing else to discover, nothing else to explore. And it was only when I started actually working in schools regularly in about my mid-20s that I was like, oh my gosh, there's, kids would ask questions and you would, research these questions and you'd be like, oh, well, we don't really know that, do we? And it's so embarrassing to admit, but there was something wrong with the way I was taking in information, I think, in my early 20s.
No, I don't think it says anything about you as much as something about that idea of authority and someone standing up and saying, this is the way the world is, and not leaving that pause and gap and saying, because that's a key thing with science as well, is to admit that we don't quite know. And what we do know, we might know wrongly. So I think that's a beautiful thing to admit, and to realize that there is so much. And kids ask the best questions. They really do ask the best questions that cut to the heart of things.
It's great. Just then you mentioned about how just the animals in our backyards, how inspiring and how they can be objects of wonder. And it just reminded me that about 10 years ago, I was doing a book about animal reproduction at the time. And I was looking at the slugs in my garden, in our backyard, on a wet night. And I was thinking, these two slugs were just beginning to get into the throes of slug lovemaking, I guess you could say. And
cue some Barry White.
Yeah, exactly. And got really close with my camera, as you do. And then the lens, the camera sort of just took focus on a little white mite that was running around on the slug. And I was like, oh, wow, there's a little mite on this slug. And then I was like, oh, God. And the closer I looked, like the more I was like, there's actually like 10 or so little of these little slug mites running around. So I thought that's kind of interesting. And I, did a bit of looking around on the internet, and I was like, okay, wow, I didn't realize this, but most slugs in the UK, at least, but actually all over the world, have their parasites. Well, we don't know if they're parasites or not, but they have living upon them and within their little gill hole thing loads of these little mites, a couple of different species. And I was like, well, that's quite cool. And I was thinking, wow, all of these snails and slugs I've looked at in my life, I've never once noticed that, but yet here they are, and they're really common. Now, the reason I'm mentioning it is because I was like, oh, I know, instead of writing about slug sex, I'll write about slug mite sex. And I thought that would be a really funny idea. And turns out, one paper's been written on slug mite sex in history, or it certainly was then. And it was a soldier who was fighting in World War II, who had a secret interest in entomology. And in his sick bed, he needed something to study. And so he asked the nurse to go and get a slug. And then he found these slug mites. He did some studies on slug mites from his sick bed. And I was like, that is incredible that this animal that's literally, 2 meters out of the back door, we still don't really know about its sex life. And mites have really weird, freaky sort of interests. They're really amazing sort of diversity of sexual behaviors. And I just thought that says it all. We are really, really, it's so easy to appreciate. It's so easy to think there's so little to understand. I'll rephrase that. It's so easy for us to think everything's been discovered. But actually, you realise that it's just a matter of perspective and it's a matter of questions. So that quote for me really resonates, because it's kind of like, wow, we really are, tossing stones into the ocean, and just, that's our every generation, I suppose, is getting that wonderful opportunity to discover more. And that actually links back to the book, actually, because that's kind of what we're seeing is, every generation throughout that 150 years, our knowledge of what a dog is essentially being reframed. And change. So yeah, no, it's a really nice quote. I completely forgot it existed until you said you need to bring a quote, and I was like, okay, I'll find a quote, and I was like, oh, I love that one, so thank you.
It's a beautiful quote, and thank you so much for sharing about the slugs. And I like that you started that saying, "Oh, I did this book about animal reproduction," but no, it's called Sex on Earth. You didn't shy away from. And then also another one on death on Earth, which is, I mean, you've really done some fascinating stuff.
Well,
And
guess which one did not sell very well. Anyway,
I was going to ask if the next one's going to be like taxes on Earth or something. But what are you working on next? I know that you got something in the pipeline. What's next for you?
There's a book about life cycles, I'm hoping, which will be that's for kids, and then a book about museums, which is again for kids, and then a book about eggs, which is for adults. And it's not birds' eggs. It's like it's the most extreme concept ever. It's just like eggs. So it's about like this early life stage, and everything that's alive, every animal that's alive goes through this stage, and it's about the kind of secret prehistory of life, I guess you could call it. So it's just like these other projects. It's just absolutely fascinating to discover all these new things and be re-engaged with this wonderful science all over again, really.
How do you like live? Where do you get money from to just do all of these cool things? Like I want your life where I get to just read about amazing things. It just sounds amazing, like eggs.
Oh, it's
incredible. You don't have to tell me how you live. I feel like that was a really personal question. Like, tell me about your life and what you...
But, I mean, like, I will say this. People just seem to... this figure of £70,000 comes up a lot. I don't know where. It must be a UK thing, but people will sometimes go like, oh, yeah, so you must be absolutely loaded. Why are you driving a car that's like, about to break down? Like, you must be loaded. And it's like... Do you not understand? Like, that's nobody in this business. Well, unless you're, I don't know, like a really well-established author, nobody's making more than a few thousand for these books. They're not an earner, if that makes sense. I mean, you kind of hope that one or two might be, but the bottom line is kind of a ruthless industry. But having said that, the beauty of it is it's a kind of, I think the first couple of books I was like, oh, here we go, this is really exciting, they're going to fly off the shelves, and actually you realize that it's actually kind of not about that. It's about expressing your interests. And I think like it's taken me this is book number 12, so it's taken me a long time, but I definitely think like that's actually what this won't work for me unless I'm actually in it for just discovering new stuff, really, and getting to talk about it.
Well, we are all the better for it. It was a really great book to read. I recommend it to everyone who's listening, and I look forward to reading more about sex and death on Earth. I think death sounds really as exciting. So thank you so much, Jules, for your time today. It's been just a whole lot of fun, and I've learned a lot from you, and hopefully I'll have you on the show again. So thank you so much.
Anytime, Claudia. Honestly, I've learned loads from you as well, so thank you very much.
Thank you to Jules Howard for being an incredible guest, to Jeremy John for the logo, and Gordon Clark for the bed music. Thank you also to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E, for sponsoring this episode. This episode was edited by Christiaan Menz and produced by myself. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Hirtenfelder.
For more great iROAR podcasts, visit iROARpod.com. That's iROARpod.com.